Futian walked up to the towering tree and looked up at it. He could feel many different types of will in this place. Futian walked up to the towering tree and looked up at it. He could feel many different types of will in this place. The tree made him think of the world tree within him, his life spirit, that could also hold all kinds of will of the great path. Could there be some kind of connection between them? It was probably just a coincidence. The world tree was his life spirit, and this tree was a divine thing in the middle of the sea of the path. It bore fruit of the way that could be used to comprehend the great path. He swept his gaze over the trunk of the mighty tree. As his eyes traveled downward, he saw that it seemed to be rooted in the mountain of the way. Its countless roots stretched out in all directions. This is the divine tree of comprehension. We can use it to comprehend the will of the great path much more efficiently, Futian said to himself. He sat down cross-legged beneath the tree and did not bother to form a resonance with any of the pieces of fruit on it. He closed his eyes and cast away all distracting thoughts. He did not think about anything in the outside world, but sank deep within himself, immersing himself in a mystical plane. He seemed to forget himself. Although his eyes were shut tightly, he could see more clearly than if his eyes had been open. His divine spirit covered a boundless area, and there was nowhere where he was not present. He could sense everything. A crisp wind blew by, seeming to contain the way within it. He sensed a fiery piece of fruit of the way. His divine spirit entered into it, and in a flash, he could feel blazing flames burning in the sky. It seemed that these flames reached up to the heavens, and they burned his divine spirit. He also felt a piece of lightning fruit. He suddenly felt like he was in a world of lightning, and he was bathed in the great path of thunder. He felt many other kinds of will. Every piece of fruit on the tree contained a frightening amount of the will of the great path. The people from Taishan Mountain were all there as well. They could sense the will contained within the fruit of the way. They sat there, sensing the world around them quietly. Will flowed over all of their bodies, except for Futian's. Below them, everyone was looking up into the air. Many of them had their eyes closed and were using their other senses. Although Futian had expelled the people who had been here previously, he had not forced them to leave. They could still sense the will of the tree from below the mountain, and thus it was still beneficial to their cultivation. Futian sat there quietly as if he could sense the world more clearly now. As time passed, Futian sank deeper into himself, until he felt like he had turned into a tree himself. The tree had worked its way into his very veins. The world tree was spreading through him, and different kinds of will flowed on every one of its trunks. The will of the great path was very potent there, and it burned like the sun in the sky. Brilliant light gradually began to shine from him, and a powerful force began to spread out from his body. The will resonated with the divine tree of comprehension, and suddenly lines of will were flowing from the tree towards him. They penetrated him. With a thought, Futian formed sword will within himself. All of the will of the divine tree of comprehension within him turned into sword will that flowed to every part of his body. To become a renhuang, one had to forge a renhuang body, comprehend a renhuang soul, and form a wheel of the great path. As Futian thought of this, endless sword will flowed through his veins, and even into his bones and organs. Outside, sword will was also flowing down from the divine tree of comprehension and over Futian's body. His entire body was soon covered in sword will. Below, some people looked up at him. There was so much sword will. Was Futian trying to forge a body of swordsmanship? Futian was bathed in sword will. The current of sword will was growing stronger and stronger as it went into him until it formed a closed loop. It would not flow out of him. It seemed like all of this powerful sword will was locked up within him. When one formed a law body and a law soul, one was on the inside, and the other was on the outside. The law body was internal, and the law soul was external. Once the two had been forged, they would resonate, and only then could one form forge the wheel of the great path, know everything under heaven, shine with the sun and the moon, and have one's every movement be in accordance with the way. This was a place to prove one's worthiness. It gave people a much better chance to become a renhuang. Everything that Futian did here was something that many people would fight to have a chance to do. Wan Shui and Luoyue seemed to feel something. They opened their eyes and saw that endless sword will was falling from the divine tree of comprehension and entering Yi Futian's body. This distressed them greatly. This genius was truly unpredictable. Yi Futian's need for will was terrifying, but the will contained within the divine tree of comprehension seemed to be endless. As time passed, Yi Futian's body seemed to be translating into a body of swordsmanship. Everything about him seemed to be made of sword will, both inside and out. Can he really comprehend this much, even without using any of the fruit of the way? Everyone asked themselves. This Yi Futian was frighteningly talented. After a while, Yi Futian had completely transformed into a sword that was sitting there with his eyes closed. Xin Jing seems to be forming a law body, said the people who were watching him from below. This is a rare opportunity, so naturally he must seize it. Let us also continue to comprehend the way, said someone, and he closed his eyes. After a few days, Yi Futian's body was like the blazing sun. The air around him seemed to be burning. He shone in all directions, making a look of surprise come over everyone's faces. But most of them were immersed in their own cultivation, and so they did not pay him too much heed. In what seemed like the blink of an eye, Yi Futian and all the others had been cultivating at the Mountain of the Way for more than 2 months. During this whole time, Yi Futian had not risen once. He was completely immersed in a state of self-forgetfulness. He could sense that there was far more to this tree than even he could see. At this moment, he was in a mystical state, and he could sense that the tree connected the whole mountain together. Its roots reached to every corner of the mountain. And it was not just the Mountain of the Way. They reached to the entire mountain range. This tree's roots connected the entire area. The tree was truly massive. All of the trees in the area were really one. At that moment, a brilliant light shone from the palace at the peak of the mountain. Everyone looked up at it. Some of them did not understand, but the disciples of the divine palace knew that the time had come. The dawn light of the great path spread out, covering the entire area and enveloping the Mountain of the Way within it. Yi Futian ceased his cultivation and opened his eyes. He looked towards the palace and saw that it was as mystical as an illusion. It gave off a sense of unreality. He guessed that it was probably an image of the divine palace. A burst of marvelous energy descended. A voice rang through the air. "Time is up. Prepare to leave," came the faint voice from the palace. Yi Futian stood up immediately. With a single thought, all of his swords shot through the air, cutting down all the giant pieces of fruit on the tree, then bringing them to him. When they saw this, the people of Taishan Mountain stopped cultivating and looked at Yi Futian. They were already perfectly satisfied with the amount of will they had been able to comprehend, and it was all thanks to the fact that Yi Futian had not blamed them for their transgressions against him. They may have had vain hopes to get more of the fruit, but now, Yi Futian had taken them all. They felt a bit disappointed by this, but it was only right and proper. The fruit on this tree was incredibly valuable. It was said that a single piece of fruit was enough to support a cultivator in forging a law body and forming a wheel of the great path. If you used one when you were at the peak of the Nirvana plane, it could help you break through to the next level. He could not lightly give up any of this fruit, even for the sake of his friendship with Taishan Mountain. Little Phoenix looked piteously at Yi Futian. Was he really so heartless? "We have been here cultivating for so long that I will give you 2 more pieces of fruit to help you reach Nirvana." Yi Futian waved his hand, and 2 pieces of fruit flew over to Little Phoenix, a flame fruit and a life fruit. Both were ones she had gotten before and had not come from the divine tree of comprehension. "So petty," whispered Little Phoenix as she took them. "If you don't want them, give them back." Yi Futian stared at her. Feng Yang put the fruit in her mouth as quickly as possible. Give them back? How could she do that? Everyone watching envied Little Phoenix a little bit. Yi Futian had not even thought of them. He had already done everything he needed to do. If they were not happy with him, was there anything they could really say? The light that covered the area grew brighter and brighter. There was a roar in the sky as another powerful beam of light shot out from the palace, swallowing up all the cultivators. In the next instant, everyone could feel the stars revolving as the scene before their eyes changed completely. Yi Futian was stunned. He looked around him and saw the endless sea of the path. Everyone was there. The mountain, the tree, and the whole land had disappeared abruptly. It was like it had all been a dream that had never happened. There was a crashing sound in front of them, and a huge demonic beast broke through the waves, then floated on the surface of the water. It was the black turtle that had brought them here before. He looked at everyone and said, "Come with me." On saying this, he turned and continued on through the sea. Everyone formed boats and followed him. Along the way, Futian could feel many eyes on him. Men of talent always arouse the envy of others. Moreover, he now had all the fruit of the divine tree. It was obvious that he would attract a lot of attention. If they were not in the Sea of the Way, but rather at the divine palace, he would probably have a fight on his hands right about now. Once they had left, there were no more rules to entangle them. People could even use Renhuang implements. And everyone there was extraordinarily powerful and had some impressive ritual implements. "Are we going to the divine palace?" Futian asked Wan Shui. Wan Shui nodded, "Yes. Don't you want to go and see such a legendary place?" Futian looked off into the distance. Far away, he could faintly see a celestial palace. It was just like before. It seemed both like a reflection in the water and real at the same time. "We will be there soon." Ahead of them, the black turtle sped up, flying over the waves. He was heading towards the place that Futian was looking at. Everyone else saw it as well. Other than the disciples of the divine palace, everyone else was curious. They all had their own expectations about it. "Of course I do," answered Futian with a smile at Wan Shui. He wanted to take a trip to the divine palace. As they got closer, they could already see a mystical island rising out of the Sea of the Way. This was the place where the premier holy land for cultivating in the higher heavens realm, the Shangxiao Divine Palace, was. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. As everyone got closer, they realized that the mystical island that rose up out of the Sea of the Way was quite vast. As everyone got closer, they realized that the mystical island that rose up out of the Sea of the Way was quite vast. Everyone was looking forward with solemn expressions on their faces as the boats flew across the water. "We are here," they all thought to themselves. The black turtle slowly sank back down to the depths of the sea. Everyone's figures flashed as they shot through the air and landed on the island. Futian and the others landed on the island as well. The air around them was thick with the aura of the Great Path, and the vast island was covered with will. There were several figures waiting on the shore. They were a few messengers who had come to welcome them. When they saw the cultivators coming, one of them said, "Those of you who passed the Sea of the Way entrance examination should familiarize yourselves with the Divine Palace. A bell will ring tomorrow, and when it does, you should all join together. Someone will be there to lead you in your cultivation. Those others among you who were part of the quota may stay in the Divine Palace to cultivate if you wish. If you do not wish to do this, you may leave whenever you want." Previously, many people had fought for the right to be part of the quota to go to the land of proving the way and thus had undergone a test at the Divine Palace. Those who were successful were already considered disciples of the Divine Palace. As for the people from the other top forces and the geniuses from throughout the higher heavens realm, if they wished to stay and become an ordinary disciple of the Divine Palace, it would naturally be quite easy. As for whether or not they could become a personal disciple, that would depend on their performance at the palace. "For the time being, you all may do as you please," continued the messenger, and upon saying so, they all turned and left, surprising all of those who had just arrived. Was the Divine Palace really so casual? "Does this mean that they don't care about us?" someone whispered. "The Divine Palace truly did things in a unique way. Aren't they worried that we will cause a disturbance?" someone asked. "Once you enter the Divine Palace, you are not forbidden from going anywhere, but that is because you are expected to take responsibility for whatever happens wherever you go. The Divine Palace is not responsible for whether you live or die," transmitted one of the personal disciples of the Divine Palace coldly. This was the Divine Palace, and there were not too many rules. As long as the place you wanted to go was somewhere that you were able to get to, you were allowed to go there. If something happened to you, the Divine Palace would not care. "This sounds like the Divine Palace, all right. They are very willful," whispered Luoyue. Do you think that our actions here can escape the notice of the people of the divine palace? Said Yi Futian with a smile. Luoyue nodded and said, You are right. There were many people of high levels in the divine palace. Their thoughts covered the entire place. No matter what they did, there was no way they could hide it from these high-level figures. The messengers who had come to greet them had left, and the disciples of the divine palace flashed away one by one as well, each returning to their places of cultivation. Let's go, said Yi Futian. They stepped forward into the divine palace. There were many mountains of the way all over the island, and there were celestial figures flying towards the mountains. All of them were of the saint level or higher. As they went inward, they saw that there were places for cultivation in between the rolling mountains. Their palaces on the tops of mountains and in the valleys. As for cavern residences and blessed places, they seemed endless. The air was thick with will. These places were all places where the people of the divine palace could cultivate. Those temples and palaces were naturally places where the great figures of the palace could teach the way, and the cavern residences and blessed places were places where the disciples could train. Yi Futian discovered that many people were following him. In addition to the disciples of Taishan Mountain, many of the other people were staring at him. At that moment, he had many of the incredible, precious pieces of fruit of the way. He was an easy target for people's greed. It was absolutely impossible that none of these powerful saints wanted to rob him of them. Moreover, it seemed that the divine palace would place no restraints on them doing so. They seem to be following you, Wan Shui transmitted to Yi Futian. Let them, replied Yi Futian. He naturally knew what they were thinking. If they tried to steal his fruit of the way, he would not be polite at all. He stopped and said to everyone, We are in the divine palace now. Everyone should go and see if you can find a chance to reach the great path. I will wander around here as well. There is no need for us to go together, so we should split up. The previous events had made the others from Taishan Mountain look at him as their leader. They were all following him, which made him a bit uncomfortable. Moreover, if a huge battle broke out, the disciples of Taishan Mountain were all of a lower level, and it would be hard for them to defend themselves, so it was better not to let them get involved. But Yu Lijin looked all around them. She could naturally see all the people staring at Yi Futian. I will be fine. I was able to take care of myself at the Mountain of the Way. There is no one here at the Divine Palace who can touch me, said Yi Futian confidently. Li Yin was used to Yi Futian by now. Given the power that he had displayed, it was indeed true that few people could threaten him. Fine, then we will split up, said Li Jin with a nod. They all went in different directions. You should go too, said Yi Futian to Wan Shui and Luo Yue. He had helped them as much as he could on this journey. He had used his song to empower Wan Shui's sword. The next time he fought, he would have to rely on himself. Very well, said Wan Shui with a nod of his head, and he left as well. Yaya turned and prepared to leave, which shocked Yi Futian. You are leaving as well? Yaya nodded. Yes. I'm going to spend some time here, cultivating. All right. Yi Futian knew why Yaya was doing this. Although she had not attracted much attention in the past, it was not certain that no one had been watching her. There was nothing out of the ordinary about her and Xin Jing knowing each other. After all, it was unlikely that she would not know anyone in the higher heavens realm. But if she were always spending her time with Yi Futian, it would be impossible to avoid drawing attention. And what about you? What are you going to do here? Yi Futian asked Little Phoenix. I am going to do my own thing. What does that have to do with you? Pouted Little Phoenix. She would not admit that she had been following Yi Futian. I'll travel with you once I get back. Until then, go off and play, said Yi Futian with a smile. Little Phoenix stared at him. Did this guy take her for a child? If you're going to go, then go. Little Phoenix spread her wings and flashed away, leaving Yi Futian alone. If someone really attacked him, then having Feng Yen by his side would be a burden. Now that he was left alone, he could relax a little. He could do whatever he wanted. He continued forward. He sensed an aura off in the distance and said, If you want to steal these from me, then just try it. Why hide? You don't want to shame old demon Luo. When he said this, a burst of mighty demonic energy filled the air. A group of figures appeared in the sky above him. It was indeed Luo Yuming and the others from the divine capital of Xiling. He had been wounded by Yi Futian at the Mountain of the Way, and he had spent all this time healing. It was obvious how much bitterness he felt towards Yi Futian. The trip to the land of proving the way was over, and Yi Futian was the only one who had many pieces of fruit of the way. And his fruit was the most precious. How could Luo Yuming not be greedy? The will that burst forth from Luo Yuming was terrible. Endless death was swept out, covering the space below him where Yi Futian was. The other cultivators from the divine capital of Xiling beside him prepared to attack as well. They blocked off all the different directions in the air above Yi Futian. You made everyone else leave. You're not scared that I would attack the people from Taishan Mountain, are you? Luo Yuming's eyes were cold, and his voice was full of killing intent. If you can take the fruit from my hands through trickery or artifice, do you think that you and the divine capital of Xiling will be able to withstand Lord Taishuan's wrath? Said Yi Futian coldly. Right now, Lord Taishan dominated the higher heavens realm. The old demon of Xiling had been defeated by him. If he wanted to attack the divine capital of Xiling, who could stop him? The strength of the elders was the greatest protection for the younger generations. Right now, the disciples of Taishan Mountain were a little bit weak, but no one would dare to harm them. A strand of sovereign power appeared upon Luo Yuming. He obviously knew that he was no match for Yi Futian in terms of combat ability. If he wanted to seize the fruit, he would have to use the power of his ritual instrument. Boom! Someone suddenly launched an attack. Death spears pierced through the air, rushing towards Yi Futian. You must have a death wish. Yi Futian swept his gaze through the air, and suddenly, sword will fill the sky. The death spears were immediately destroyed, and the sword will continued onward, leaving sword slashes in the air. The sword light pieced through the air, and slash marks appeared on the demonic cultivator. Blood spurted from his head as he stared at Yi Futian below them. Then, he gradually slackened and fell to the ground below. He had been killed by a single sword stroke. He's gotten stronger. When Luo Yuming felt the power of that sword, his heart trembled. Obviously, cultivating for 2 months, had Yi Futian even stronger than when they had fought. His sword had pierced through the air. A common Nirvana-level cultivator was no match for him at all. Moreover, Yi Futian had used a killing move right away. This made Luo Yuming and the other cultivators from the divine capital of Xiling look at him coldly. They could not forget this easily. I know that you have a Renhuang implement, but how do you know that I don't? I don't want to cause any trouble, and I don't like it when other people cause me trouble. If anyone else attacks me, they will die, said Yi Futian coldly. He was not only speaking to Luo Yuming. He was reminding everyone who was watching him in secret. It was not good that these people were always thinking about him, so he had executed one as a warning to the rest. Moreover, the man from the divine capital of Xiling had attacked him first, and he had just counterattacked. Although he was only a musician from Taishan Mountain, Lord Taishan had personally mentioned him by name. If an elder came after him due to this matter, he would have to think about how Taishan Mountain would respond. When he heard Yi Futian's unmistakable threat, Luo Yuming's face became livid. Imperial power was still blooming from him, but it was just like Yi Futian had said. He had a Renhuang-level ritual implement, but how did he know that Yi Futian did not have one as well? If it really came down to a fight, his opponent would probably not hesitate to kill them. If things were like they had been before, they would not be up to the task. All the rest of you, stop following me. Otherwise, my sword will be merciless, said Yi Futian. Everyone watched as he flew through the air, going faster and faster. The sword light cut a swathe through the air as he went off into the distance. A group of figures walked out and watched the retreating figure with cold expressions. But in the end, none of them followed him. Guy Shirshir walked out as well, golden divine light flashing on him. This man had offended many of the cultivators of the divine palace. It would be impossible for him to enter the palace without causing a disturbance. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Within the divine palace, all the disciples returned to their places of cultivation. Within the divine palace, all the disciples returned to their places of cultivation. At that moment, there were several figures standing around and chatting on a cultivation platform within one of the halls. One of them was outstandingly good-looking and had a celestial aura about her. It was Lu Qingyao. "He seized both the water of the stream of life and the fruit of the way?" asked a youth, standing up and bowing to Lu Qingyao. Lu Qingyao nodded. "My cultivation has been too shallow. I must spend some time locked away cultivating. This man is nearly a demon. He defeated all the other cultivators by himself and took over the divine tree of comprehension. This has nothing to do with the level of your cultivation, Sister Lu," said a woman standing down below. At that moment, another figure entered, looked at them, and asked, "Someone took over the divine tree of comprehension by himself?" Yes, it was the swordsman from Taishan Mountain, Xinjing. He fought everyone by himself and defeated all comers. No one was a match for them. Gai Shishir of the Golden Divine Nation, Li Sun of the Divine Sword Li family, and Qin Zong of the Sky-Bearing God clan were all defeated in that battle. None of them could stand before him. Can this be true? The person who had entered gazed at Lu Qingyao in shock. Lu Qingyao nodded slightly and said, "I had originally thought that besides those personal disciples from within the palace, I could be ranked among the strongest of those who had been chosen to go, even if I was not the strongest. But I would never have thought that the gap between us would be so great. Maybe Xinjing was incredibly strong, but it is still my fault that I lost." Xinjing did not even become a nirvana-level cultivator until the battle. So you are saying that he took so much of the fruit by himself, yet he did not prove himself worthy of becoming a Renhuang, but instead only managed to reach nirvana? A surprised look came over the young woman's face. She had heard that when people went to the land of proving the way, they would often use it as an opportunity to reach the Renhuang plane. But this time, one person had taken most of the fruit. Lu Qingyao nodded again. After taking over the divine tree of comprehension, he spent more than 2 months cultivating there. What was flowing over him constantly the whole time? It is possible that he was able to use this to forge a law body. It is highly likely that he became stronger. When added to the amount of fruit of the way that he got, it would be enough to lessen the time he would need to cultivate by several years, stabilize his attainment of the nirvana plane, and even start to forge a body of the great path. In that case, it seems that a genius has come to our divine palace. There was a bit of excitement in her eyes. This was not the only place that people were talking about this. The news was spreading all throughout the divine palace. For example, Li Sun was in Sword Palace, telling someone about all of these events. There were many swordsmen behind the man he was talking to, sword will wrapping around them. But no matter how powerful they were all standing behind the youth in the black robes. He was the strongest member of the Divine Sword Li family of that generation, Li Dozi. Now, he was the strongest person in the Sword Palace below the Renhuang level. His swordsmanship was nearly perfect. Many people said that he could kill anyone below the Renhuang level with his sword. Of course, there were several people within the Divine Palace who were not inferior to him in terms of swordsmanship. I had originally planned that after you entered the Divine Palace, I would shut myself away in cultivation and not come out until I had reached the Renhuang level. Now it seems like there may be someone whom I can test my swordsmanship on before I break through to the next level, said Li Daozi softly. He was at the peak of the nirvana level and had forged a law body. He would soon break through to the next level. And now, another powerful swordsman had entered the Divine Palace. Li Daozi stepped away. "Where are you going?" asked Li Sun. Was Li Daozi going directly to seek out Yi Futian? "I am going to Sword Comprehension Mountain," answered Li Daozi without turning his head. "I will wait for him there." Yi Futian was a swordsman of Taishan Mountain, and his swordsmanship was outstanding. Now that he had entered the Divine Palace, there was one place that he had to go. That was Sword Comprehension Mountain. Thus, Li Daozi was preparing to go there to wait for him. Xinjing's name had circulated throughout the Divine Palace in a very short time. The disciples of the palace all knew his name and knew that he had defeated the proud cultivators of the higher heavens realm all by himself and had taken over the divine tree of comprehension. Many of the personal disciples of the Divine Palace who had not gone to the land of proving the way wanted to go and see him. At the same time as this, the news that Li Daozi had gone to Sword Comprehension Mountain to wait for Xinjing made its way through the palace as well, which excited many people. It was said that this swordsman from Taishan Mountain had easily defeated Li Sun. So, how would he compare to Li Daozi, the foremost swordsman under the Renhuang level at the Divine Palace? It was said that Li Daozi would soon reach the next level, and would soon become a sword emperor. He was the best swordsman in the Divine Palace under the Renhuang level. It would be difficult to find any swordsman in the higher heavens realm who could match him. Yi Futian did not know that Li Daozi had gone to Sword Comprehension Mountain. He did not even know that there was a Sword Comprehension Mountain in the Divine Palace, or what it was. After he asked the others to leave, he strolled through the palace alone, going where he pleased. He was very relaxed. Since the Divine Palace was so casual, there was no need to stand on ceremony. The celestial will of the island was extremely thick in the air. There must be many places here that were good for cultivation. He wondered if he would find a place that would help him break through to the next level. The will is so strong. At that moment, Yi Futian sensed something. He flashed over to a place in the distance and soon came to a place between several high mountains. The ancient mountains surrounded this place, and incredibly thick wool was spreading out from it. Yi Futian flashed around the area around the mountains. Suddenly, he could sense an incredible amount of pressure in the area. It seemed to be powerful enough to crush the very sky. He felt his body tighten as the incredible pressure fell upon him. A figure was sitting on a huge rock in front of him, with his back to him. He had short hair, and he looked neat and clean. His robe was incredibly broad. He was sitting there motionless, just like a statue. "I am Xinjing from Taishan Mountain. I apologize for disturbing your cultivation," said Yi Futian to the man with a slight bow. This figure was also at the nirvana level, but his aura was thick with power. His heavy breathing was powerful as well. His every breath seemed to be filled with the will of the great path. A swordsman of Taishan Mountain. The man still had his back to Yi Futian. "Have you come to prove yourself worthy of following the great path?" "Yes, after going to the land of proving the way, I have come to the Divine Palace," answered Yi Futian. "Since you are a swordsman, you should go to Sword Comprehension Mountain." "This is not a place for you," said the man indifferently. A look of surprise came over Yi Futian's face. "Sword Comprehension Mountain? Yes, that is the place for cultivating swordsmanship," the man continued. He had been cultivating here all along, and thus had not heard the news that had come from the outside world. Yi Futian looked around at the mountains and asked, "Sword Comprehension Mountain is the place to go for cultivating swordsmanship. So what is this place? I thought that this would also be a good place for me to cultivate." The man was not the least bit surprised by Yi Futian's words. After a moment, he rose slowly as Yi Futian watched, then turned and looked at him. Yi Futian looked up at the figure and suddenly felt a burst of incomparably majestic pressure of the great path descend. The figure seemed incredibly tall, and he stood there like a god. The pressure fell upon Yi Futian, and at that moment, Yi Futian felt that he should surrender. As Yi Futian looked at the mountains, he seemed to be able to see them moving. Divine power of the great path burst forth from them. The figure who was standing there became one with the mountains, or perhaps it was just his will integrating into them. His eyes seemed to be beholding infinite power. "See for yourself." The figure stood there calmly with his hands clasped behind his back. The power coming out of those mountains pressed down upon Yi Futian. They seemed to come to life, and each one contained the power of the great path. The stones beneath his feet shattered and were ground into dust. "I see." Yi Futian could feel the mountains pressing down on him. At that moment, he seemed to see many figures. The mountains seemed to contain the will of the great path. Their power was truly frightening. Every mountain seemed like it was a statue. Yi Futian floated up into the air. The man glanced at him, then stepped forward, causing a huge roar to ring out between heaven and earth. But Yi Futian stepped forward as well. Boom! Two forces collided in a violent explosion in the air, making all of the mountains shake. The man looked at Yi Futian in surprise, then looked at the mountains around them. "You moved the mountains with a single thought." He stared at Yi Futian. "You are a swordsman?" I am Xin Jing, the swordsman of Taishan Mountain, said Yi Futian. In fact, he was surprised. This man had put a lot of pressure on him. In his previous battle, he had defeated all his opponents, and he had thought that no one within the Divine Palace would be a match for him. But he had run into an incredibly strong opponent just while walking around the palace. I am the personal disciple of Divine Palace, Zhuang Hong, answered the man. He looked at Yi Futian. I heard that Lord Taishan has not personally taken a disciple in a long time. Are you his youngest disciple? Yi Futian shook his head. Lord Taishan said that he would never take a disciple again. I have not even been cultivating at Taishan Mountain for a year. How could I be Lord Taishuan's disciple? You are so talented, and yet Lord Taishan has ignored you? Asked Zhuang Hong with a smile. Have you come to the Divine Palace to try and become a personal disciple, or have you just come to cultivate for a short while? I've just come to cultivate, said Yi Futian. Well, the Divine Palace is the best place in the higher heavens realm to do so. Just this place where we are now is good enough to cultivate in for several years. What about Sword Comprehension Mountain, which you mentioned before? Asked Yi Futian. That is a holy land for cultivating swordsmanship. It is surrounded by 81 sword mountains. If you can completely comprehend the way of swordsmanship on Sword Comprehension Mountain, you will certainly be able to forge a wheel of the great path out of swords and become a sword emperor, said Zhuang Hong. Sword Comprehension Mountain was the place where the swordsmen of the Divine Palace went to cultivate. Many of the elders of previous generations had broken through to the next level there. In that case, I would like to go there, said Yi Futian quietly. Of course you do, came a voice. Yi Futian looked up and saw a figure standing on the peak of one of the mountains. He clasped his hands together and bowed to Zhuang Hong, saying, Brother Zhuang. Zhuang Hong nodded slightly and said, What did you mean by that? Li Daozi of the Divine Sword Li family has already climbed Sword Comprehension Mountain and is waiting for him there, said the man with a smile. He obviously already knew who Yi Futian was. Li Daozi, muttered Yi Futian. This was not the first time he had heard that name. He is the foremost swordsman of the Divine Palace below the Renhuang level, and he only has the final 3 sword strikes left to comprehend. Zhuang Hong looked at Yi Futian. Li Daozi was actually waiting for him? If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Zhuang Hong looked at Yi Futian curiously and asked, What did you do? Zhuang Hong looked at Yi Futian curiously and asked, What did you do? He knew a little bit about Li Daozi. He was proud and aloof by nature, but his swordsmanship was unparalleled. There were few people in the Divine Palace whom he considered worth his time, and it was said that he was rushing towards the Renhuang level. There were only 3 swords left for him to comprehend on Sword Comprehension Mountain, and once he did so, he could forge a sword wheel of the Great Path and reach the Renhuang Plain. If he was waiting for Yi Futian on Sword Comprehension Mountain, then this man before his eyes must have done some incredible things at the land of proving the way. Nothing. This is probably because I defeated his little brother, said Yi Futian. No, given Li Daozi's personality, if it had just been the fact that his little brother was defeated at your hands in the land of proving the way, he would not go through the trouble of waiting for you on Sword Comprehension Mountain. He wants to test himself by fighting you. Thus, you must be an uncommonly skilled swordsman yourself, said Zhuang Hong with a smile. Yi Futian had called himself the swordsman of Taishan Mountain. Shen Jing defeated all the proud sons of heaven by himself at the land of proving the way, including by Xiu, a personal disciple from our own palace, said the man who had come with a slight smile. Zhuang Hong looked at Yi Futian. So that's how it was. In that case, there was nothing strange at all about Li Daozi waiting for him on Sword Comprehension Mountain. Are you going now? He asked with a smile. A man who could move mountains with a thought was naturally no ordinary man. What is this place? Asked Yi Futian. These mountains were all mountains of the way and were holy lands for cultivation. Since he had come here, he naturally wanted to spend some time cultivating. These are the celestial worthy mountains, answered Zhuang Hong. A celestial worthy from the Divine Palace once used this place to comprehend the way, and his will still exists in all of these mountains. It is very well suited to one of the techniques of the divine palace. Here you can sense the way of pressure and power. You so must have cultivated this technique, Brother Zhuang, said Yi Futian. Zhuang Hong nodded. In that case, I am going to spend some time here cultivating, Yi Futian continued. What about Sword Cultivation Mountain? Asked Zhuang Hong. He is the one who is waiting for me. I don't want to go to him, said Yi Futian with a smile and a shrug. Zhuang Hong was stunned, but what he said made sense. Then go ahead and cultivate, he said with a smile. Yi Futian nodded and sat cross-legged on the ground. Then he brought out a piece of fruit of the way and popped it into his mouth, biting into it right as he sat there. Zhuang Hong looked at Yi Futian in shock. He was so shameless. Yi Futian looked at Zhuang Hong's darkening expression and blinked. He took another bite. This piece of fruit of the way is very large, he said while he was chewing. It is truly worthy of being from the divine tree of comprehension. Upon saying this, he continued chewing with relish. He quickly finished eating the fruit as Zhuang Hong watched him wide-eyed and slack-jawed. I am going to cultivate now, Brother Zhuang, said Yi Futian when he had finished eating. He closed his eyes, and suddenly, the roaring great path rang out from within him, filling the air in a flash. It resonated with the mountains. In that instant, Zhuang Hong felt a terrible pressure. He looked up at the mountains around them and saw that they seemed to come to life. Faces appeared upon all of them. Amazing, said Zhuang Hong approvingly. Shen Jing's feeling for and comprehension of the great path was simply astounding. No wonder he had been able to move the mountains with a single thought. As he thought of this, he returned to the stone that he had originally been sitting on and shut his eyes in cultivation. For a time, the two of them had terrible power of the great path bursting forth from them, putting pressure on everything in the vast area. Yi Futian kept cultivating there quietly. Although he was traveling around under the identity of the swordsman Shen Jing, he could not really only cultivate swordsmanship. In order to reach the Renhuang level, he had to forge a wheel of the great path, and he naturally did not want to forge just one kind. His world tree life spirit gave him a great advantage in terms of cultivation that he would be able to continue to use when he reached the Renhuang plain, so how could he waste it? So he ate another piece of fruit. At this moment, he needed the fruit of the way far more than anyone else. A day passed. Sword Comprehension Mountain had many ancient peaks, and each one was its own sword mountain that contained mighty sword will. Many people had gathered there. Some had come to cultivate, and some had come to join in the fun. The news that Li Daozi had come to Sword Comprehension Mountain to wait for Shen Jing had spread, and many people wanted to watch. Li Daozi was the foremost member of the younger generation of the Sword Palace. Who would be stronger? Him or the swordsman from Taishan Mountain? At that moment, many people were standing before one of the sword mountains. Someone asked, "Has Shen Jing still not come?" Someone said that Shen Jing is cultivating at the Celestial Worthy Mountains. Someone beside him answered, "The Celestial Worthy Mountains are not a place for swordsmanship. What is he doing there?" Who knows? Many people were discussing this. Wan Shuyi and Yaya were there as well. They had not come because of the news, but because they wanted to comprehend the way of swordsmanship. At that moment, the sound of a bell ringing filled the air. Everyone looked off in the distance. It seemed that a wave of divine power was spreading throughout the heavens and the earth. The bell rang again, and suddenly a group of figures soared through the sky in the directions that the divine power was coming from. The divine palace had summoned its new disciples. Of course, many of them did not go but stayed there cultivating. Soon, many people were gathered together in a public square in the divine palace. Many of the disciples of the divine palace had come to join in the fun as well. Up on a stairway, there were several elders of the divine palace as well as some of their personal disciples. They were looking down at the new arrivals, and one of them said, "Here we go again. I wonder how the new disciples will be this time." Given their trip to the land of proving the way, there should be many powerful figures among them. There are also many people from top forces who were on the quota here. They are prepared to enter the divine palace. Li Daozi's brother, Li Sun, is here as well. Someone pointed to where Li Sun was. He was going to enter the divine palace to cultivate. Someone looked off in a certain direction and smiled. "How is it that you had time to come here today, Brother E?" At that moment, a figure with an imposing presence appeared. He had a powerful aura that seemed to be innate. It was the prince of the heavenly mandate realm, Futian. "The master must have asked you to come here and choose disciples," said one of the young men with a smile. "These new disciples are certainly lucky that you came out here to greet them personally," said someone else beside him. Tianyu smiled slightly and nodded. He walked to the edge of the stairs and looked down at everyone. There was another outstanding-looking person beside him. The two of them were so imposing that few people dared look directly at them. But everyone's attention was on them. One glance at the two of them was enough to tell that they were extraordinary, even within the divine palace. "I heard that a genius appeared during this trip to the land of proving the way," whispered Tianyu. "You're interested in that matter too?" asked the woman beside him with a smile. "Li Daozi went to Sword Comprehension Mountain because of him. He must be outstanding in some way, so I want to meet him. I wonder if he came here because he wants to join the Divine Palace," said Tianyu. There were few people in the Divine Palace who could compare to him, but Li Daozi of Sword Palace was one of those few. "He probably won't come," said the woman. "I heard that he is cultivating at the Celestial Worthy Mountains. Zhuang Hong is there as well." "Zhuang Hong. He must be close to the Renhuang level by now," Tianyu said quietly. The woman nodded. "However, you must be even closer than Li Daozi and Zhuang Hong, right?" Tianyu looked off into the distance. "What does it matter how close I am? I still have a long way to go." Many cultivators had gathered together at Sword Comprehension Mountain. Some swordsmen had been cultivating here all along, and others had come because they had heard about Xinjing and had specifically come to see him. Many cultivators had gathered together at Sword Comprehension Mountain. Some swordsmen had been cultivating here all along, and others had come because they had heard about Xinjing and had specifically come to see him. He was the genius who had defeated all the other geniuses of the higher heavens realm. Although he was already so famous throughout the Divine Palace, the more he refused to show his hand, the more the people of the palace wanted to know how strong he was. Especially since a swordsman as powerful as Li Daozi was waiting here at Sword Comprehension Mountain for him. At that moment, two figures were streaking through the sky towards the mountain. Everyone stared at them as soon as they appeared. He had finally come. They had all been waiting for a long time. "Brother Zhuang Hong," whispered everyone when they saw the figure beside Yi Futian. Zhuang Hong was another extremely prestigious figure within the Divine Palace. Apparently, Xinjing had been spending his time at Celestial Worthy Mountain, cultivating with Zhuang Hong. "Brother Zhuang," people said as the two of them arrived, and many of them bowed. This made a look of surprise come over Yi Futian's face. He looked strangely at the man beside him. It seemed like he had an incredibly high position within the Divine Palace. No wonder he had put so much pressure upon him when they had first met. However, they had not fought, otherwise he would truly know Zhuang Hong's power. Yi Futian saw some familiar faces. Fighting will appeared in many of their eyes when they looked at him. It seemed like they wanted to see just how strong this man who was so highly regarded was. Moreover, there was someone else there who surprised Yi Futian. Tianyu was there as well. However, Yi Futian's gaze did not linger on Tianyu. He just looked at him for a moment and then looked elsewhere. "Zhuang Hong," said Tianyu. Zhuang Hong turned his gaze upon him, then at the woman beside him. "Are you two together?" Previously, although there had been developments in the relationship between the two of them, they had not reached the step of actually being together. But now they were standing shoulder to shoulder. Could it be that he had been completely focusing on cultivating up to the Renhuang level and thus had overlooked things going on the Divine Palace? Tianyu smiled thinly but did not answer. His gaze fell upon Yi Futian, and he said, "I am Tianyu, a disciple of the Divine Palace." "I am Yi Man, a disciple of the Divine Palace," the woman beside him said to Yi Futian. Although she was smiling at him, Yi Futian could faintly feel her powerful arrogance. She had a sense of nobility about her that seemed inborn. She seemed to be a good match for Tianyu. Moreover, her surname was Yi, just like his. These two are not from the higher heavens realm, they come from other realms within the 9 supreme regions. However, they are both members of top forces. It is said that one of them is the prince of a divine dynasty, and the other is a princess of an ancient nation, so they both are of incredibly high status. They are both very talented and are very well suited to each other, Zhuang Hong transmitted to Yi Futian, giving him a simple introduction to these two. Yi Futian knew of Yi Tianyu but had never realized that Yi Man was also not from the higher heavens realm. Was it because they were both far from home that they developed feelings for each other? I am Xin Jing of Taishan Mountain. Yi Futian nodded to each of them in turn. I have heard of the peerless swordsman of Taishan Mountain, Xin Jing. Now all the disciples of the Divine Palace want to see you, and this has now become my wish as well, said Yi Tianyu with a smile, seeming very polite. At that moment, Yi Tianyu was acting completely different than when he had seen him in the heavenly mandate realm. Of course, this could be because he was in a different mood. No need to be so polite, said Yi Futian with a slight smile. Yi Tianyu said no more. He had come today only because he was curious. Li Daozi was, after all, someone who was at the same level of fame as him. Thus, the battle between him and the swordsman from Taishan Mountain was worth paying attention to. At that moment, an incredibly cold will descended upon Yi Futian. He frowned and turned his gaze. He saw a group of figures appear. These people were surrounded by an incredibly cold aura that felt as cold as ice that would never melt in 1,000 years. There seemed to be wind and snow in their eyes, and everyone they looked at seemed extremely cold. There was someone in the group that Yi Futian recognized, one whom he had left a deep impression on. After all, he had seized the stream of life from her and then taken her fruit of the way. How could he have not left a deep impression? The woman was Lu Qingyao, and there was a young man in a white robe with her. His hair was as white as snow, and his facial features were exquisite, but his aura was cold. He was the one who had the strongest aura among them. He looked back at Yi Futian when he felt his eyes on her. At that moment, Yi Futian felt he had entered another world, a world of endless snow and ice. His thoughts seemed to freeze as if he was in a field of snow. His blood seemed to have been infected by ice as well. With just a glance, Yi Futian seemed to have been covered in a layer of ice, and it seemed like he had turned into an ice sculpture. Ha! A look of surprise came over Yi Futian's face. Li Daozi had not done anything yet, and someone else wanted to fight Yi Futian first? Moreover, this was a personal disciple of 2 of the palaces within the Divine Palace. That was how talented he was. 2 of the top figures of the age were teaching him. Lu Qingyao was his sworn sister, and Bai Xiu, the personal disciple of Lord Underworld, who had been wounded by Yi Futian, was his sworn brother. This man was also a personal disciple of Lord Underworld. This was Jiang Su, one of the top figures within the Divine Palace. Yi Futian's blood rushed faster when he felt the cold will enter him. Terrible yet majestic sword will swept out from within him, driving away the cold will. His eyes flashed like swords as he looked back at his opponent. In a flash, the space around the 2 of them was subject to an immense amount of pressure. Falling snow seemed to fill the sky, and there was incredibly sharp sword will among the flying snowflakes. Neither of them moved, but they seemed to have entered another world. It was a world of endless snow and sword will. Yi Futian stood facing his opponent. This Jiang Su had already formed a soul of the way, and his divine spirit was incredibly frightening. Jiang Su was trying to freeze his spiritual soul. What are they doing? A look of surprise came over the faces of the people on Sword Comprehension Mountain. The temperature around them was falling continuously, and sword will had already spread off into the distance. But the 2 of them still had not moved. It seemed that they were both in a meditative state. Their spiritual souls are fighting, someone said. A wild ice storm blew all around them, swallowing up Yi Futian and the others. But the fierce sword will was not diminished. It continued to flow around them endlessly. A destructive sound rang out as the great path roared within Yi Futian, destroying everything. There was a clear, crisp sound as if something had snapped. Suddenly, the ice storm began to weaken, and the sword will dissipated as well. The ice on Yi Futian melted, and Jiang Su's eyes became normal once again. He looked long and hard in Yi Futian, then said, "It seems that Sister Lu's defeat was not a fluke." Beside him, Lu Qingyao glanced at him. She was speechless. It seemed like Brother Jiangsu was also admitting how powerful this man was. "Do you wish to test me any more?" Yi Futian asked Jiangsu. "Li Daozi has been waiting here for you for a long time. This matter is now between the two of you," answered Jiangsu. The snow and ice disappeared, as he was no longer unleashing his power. Previously, he had just been testing Yi Futian to see how powerful his spiritual soul was. The will within him could not be stopped. He was clearly a powerful being. Yi Futian turned and looked towards Sword Comprehension Mountain with its 81 peaks. Each peak looked like a sword reaching up into the heavens, trying to pierce through the clouds. His eyes seemed to pierce across the distance. Within all of those sword peaks, he saw a figure sitting quietly in front of the second to last mountain. He seemed to not have realized that Yi Futian had arrived, and was not paying attention. Yi Futian started forward. At that moment, someone rose into the air, looked towards where Li Daozi was, and called out, "Brother Li, Xinjing is here." Li Daozi seemed not to hear him. He still sat where he was. But at that moment, sword will burst out from among the sword mountains, and sword light flashed all around. The sword will seemed endless as it flowed around. The one who had called forth all this power seemed to be the man who was sitting there without moving. "You are the one I have been waiting for. Let us comprehend the next sword stroke here and now," came a misty voice that resounded through the air. Everyone could hear the arrogance in that voice. He had been waiting here for Xinjing for a long time. But if Xinjing could not comprehend the next sword stroke then and there, then what right did he have to make him wait? And what right did he have to make him draw his sword? Li Daozi did not only want to fight this battle because Yi Futian had defeated his brother Li Sun. If that had been all, then he would not come here. What he wanted was to find a swordsman who was his equal so that he could prove himself. Everyone's eyes were on Yi Futian. Someone said, "All right, Xinjing. Comprehend the next sword stroke." A look of surprise came over Yi Futian's face when he heard this. He smiled and walked towards the mountains. He could see sword will flowing within the mountains. "I did not come to Sword Comprehension Mountain to challenge anyone, nor to prove anything. If I comprehend the next sword stroke, it won't be for anyone else. It will simply be because I am cultivating the way of swordsmanship." Yi Futian stepped forward as he said this. His thoughts flowed, and in an instant, endless sword will shot up into the clouds, transforming into a sword that stuck up from one of the mountains. Then another one came from a second mountain, then a third. Brilliant sword light shone from the peaks one by one, making everyone stare at the sight. Was he comprehending the sword strokes? How was he doing it so fast? Li Daozi had his pride. If Yi Futian could not comprehend these swords right in front of him, then he would not be qualified to fight him. Yi Futian was the same. He had not come here because Li Daozi was waiting for him, nor because he wanted to challenge Li Daozi. He had only come because this was a good place to cultivate swordsmanship. Everyone watched as Yi Futian walked forward. With every step, more swords shot up from the mountain peaks around him. The sword will of the great path burst forth, flowing towards him and casting brilliant light. Everyone was speechless as they watched this scene. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. How had he comprehended these swords so fast? How had he comprehended these swords so fast? Even the personal disciples were staring at Yi Futian, especially the people of the Sword Palace of the Divine Palace. They were looking at him particularly sharply. Sword Comprehension Mountain was the place you had to go if you were a swordsman. But as far as they could remember, no one in their generation had comprehended the swords this fast. Had Li Daozi, the most powerful person below the Renhuang level in the Sword Palace, even been able to do that? That was amazing. Zhuang Hong looked at Yi Futian speechlessly. It was enough that he had moved the mountain with a single thought, and now he was able to comprehend swords so effortlessly? Yi Tianyu and Yi Man came up to him, and Yi Tianyu said, "He comprehended the swords with a single thought. Is there anyone else in the Sword Palace who can do that?" "Historically, there probably was someone," said Zhuang Hong. But as far as I know, no one in this generation has done so. When Li Daozi first joined the Sword Palace, he was able to comprehend 49 swords in a single day, which shocked everyone in the Divine Palace, and the Lord of the Sword Palace took him as his personal disciple. So, he wants to break Li Daozi's record, said Yi Tianyu softly. You came here with him, so must have been able to sense how extraordinary he is. Have you ever fought him? Zhuang Hong shook his head, saying, This man is extremely interesting. Yi Futian had moved the mountains with a single thought when he came to the celestial worthy palace, which had made Zhuang Hong very interested in him. Later, he had spent his time cultivating and had eaten a piece of fruit of the way right in front of him. He was truly shameless. Who do you think is a better swordsman, him or Li Daozi? Asked Yi Tianyu. He was also quite interested. We will know when they fight, answered Zhuang Hong. Li Daozi had been cultivating in the Divine Palace for many years and had been taught swordsmanship personally by the Lord of the Sword Palace, so his current combat ability was incredible. Even though Yi Futian had made a name for himself during the battle at the Land of Proving the Way, he would not dare say that he would definitely defeat Li Daozi. It was hard to see which one of them would be stronger. Endless sword will flowed between the peaks as Yi Futian strode forward. Sword will flowed out from each peak that he passed. It was as if the swords were resonating with the great path. He shone with celestial brilliance as the sword fill swirled around him. The sword will was even flowing through his veins and engraved and on his bones. His blood surged and seethed. Is he even human? Wan Shi had been cultivating swordsmanship on Sword Comprehension Mountain for a while, but his progress had been slow. Now that he saw how well Yi Futian was doing, he was speechless. He was one of the best swordsmen of Taishan Mountain. Otherwise, he would not have been chosen to come here. So why was the distance between him and Yi Futian so great? Look at his eyes, said Luo Yue beside him. She was staring at Yi Futian's eyes, which at that moment were extremely enchanting. They were deep beyond all compare. They were like sword eyes and also like eyes of the way. They could see through the worldly great path with a single glance. Perhaps he has cultivated some special power that lets him see the sword will within Sword Comprehension Mountain. Wan Shi was also fixated on his eyes. In fact, it seemed that he had actually guessed the truth. Yi Futian naturally did not know what they were all thinking. At that moment, he was completely immersed in a state of selflessness. He could not see other people, only swords. Within his divine spirit, those mountains were no longer mountains. They were made of sword will. The sword will that each mountain contained was different. It seemed that the elders of the Divine Palace had inscribed the sword will on each mountain. In his current mystical state, each of the sword mountains seemed to transform into swords. Unreal figures practiced swordsmanship, engraving it upon his mind, and endless sword will flowed into him, making it feel like he was under incredible pressure. His life will was so magnificent that it pushed his body to its limits. He took out a piece of fruit of the way and put it in his mouth. He's doing it again. Zhuang Hong had the urge to hit Yi Futian. Everyone else watched with mouth and eyes wide open, especially those who had competed with him in the Land of Proving the Way. Those who had been defeated in battle by him were even more speechless as they watched this. This was too much. How many sword mountains is that? Someone whispered. He seemed to be asking himself. The sword will is flowing from 32 sword mountains, and they are all resonating with him, someone answered quietly. They all trembled inwardly. Although Yi Futian was slowing down, he had not stopped yet. It was just that the length of time between each step was growing. He finally stopped walking forward. He returned to his original place and stood there quietly, sensing the world around him. The sound of sword will whistled throughout him. He finally stopped, said many people. However, after only a short time, he moved again. He was submerged in endless sword will as he stepped forward, and powerful sword will flowed out from the mountains behind him once again, shooting towards him. Interesting, many people thought to themselves. Yi Futian had very quickly surpassed everything that Li Daozi had done. Li Daozi and Yi Futian had spoken to each other arrogantly. Now, the swordsman from Taishan Mountain had responded to Li Daozi with his actions. He had come here to comprehend the way of swordsmanship. It had nothing to do with Li Daozi. 48 swords. Many of the people on Sword Comprehension Mountain were very interested in Yi Futian now. It was very common for people to come to Sword Comprehension Mountain to cultivate the way of swordsmanship, and most people would not pay them any attention. But Yi Futian had attracted a lot of attention because of the issue with Li Daozi. Then he had shocked everyone with the number of swords he had comprehended. Now everyone forgot about their cultivation, and they watched him comprehend the way of swordsmanship. As Yi Futian continued forward, the swords of the 49th sword peak whistled as they flowed towards Yi Futian. Within about an hour, he had comprehended 49 swords. This had taken Li Daozi an entire day. At that moment, Li Daozi was still seated in cultivation at the second peak, not caring about anything else. It seemed as if none of this mattered to him. His body shone with brilliant light, and his sword will surge to the heavens. It seemed like he would be able to cut through the very heavens with a single thought. Li Sun appeared not far behind him. He had been watching Yi Futian all along. He sighed inwardly. He would never have thought that such a genius swordsman would come from Taishan Mountain. At that moment, Li Daozi suddenly asked a question with his eyes closed. 49 swords? He seemed to be talking to himself. Yes, 49 swords. Li Sun had a dark look on his face. Li Daozi nodded slightly, then continued to cultivate with his eyes closed. He still lacked 2 swords, but he was not far from the Renhuang level. He had needed a strong swordsman to appear so that he could test himself. It was good that Yi Futian was here. He was not surprised at all that Yi Futian had completely surpassed what he had done before. He was completely calm, and he waited quietly. He had already confirmed that Yi Futian could make it to where he was now. Yi Futian stopped once again after having comprehended 49 swords. He sat back down in his original place. He had finished his fruit, and his whole body was covered in endless sword will, like he was in a cocoon. This time he stopped for a while. It was not that he was unable to understand the next ones. It was just that he had realized the first 49 words were different from the ones that came after. The first 49 swords were of a single style. This meant that no matter how many there were, at their most basic level, they were all the same sword. But after these swords, the rest were different. It seems like he sensed it, thought the people of the Sword Palace as they watched Yi Futian. The first 49 swords were the foundation of Sword Comprehension Mountain. A genius swordsman of the Divine Palace had once put forward the idea that all of the different sword styles in the world could trace their roots to these 49 swords. As long as you had these 49 swords as your base, you could create infinite different sword styles. After the genius swordsman had created these 49 swords, the sword cultivators of the Divine Palace had carved their sword will into the mountain peaks. Afterward, many powerful sword emperors had taken these 49 swords as their foundation and created many different sword styles. These were carved into the later mountains. Thus the current Sword Comprehension Mountain had been created. Yi Futian sat there calmly, without any distractions. It was as if he had entered into a world of pure swordsmanship. The images of 49 swords appeared around him, and each one was different. It felt like these 49 swords were carved into his mind. Even though this was not some incredible sword art or ultimate school of swordsmanship, Yi Futian could still feel the brilliance of those swords. If he could completely comprehend these 49 swords, then he could cultivate any sword art in the future. It would be possible for him to create even greater sword arts with less effort. Time passed, and Yi Futian was still sitting there without even the slightest reaction. It seemed as if he was completely immersed in comprehending the way of swordsmanship. How has he still not moved? A look of surprise came over everyone's face. Half a day had already passed. He had comprehended 49 swords in about an hour, but he had not moved since then. He's waiting, said someone. They waited for more than a day. Yi Futian was still sitting there, not reacting to anything around him. In the past, Li Daozi comprehended 49 swords in a day, but it seemed like he was able to advance quickly from there. Shen Jing comprehended 49 swords in an hour, but he has not moved since then. Could it be that he was resorting to trickery? Maybe he had not truly comprehended them, and is now spending all this time to do so? Someone surmised. One day was actually a very short period of time, and it was normal to be comprehending for this long. But Yi Futian had performed so brilliantly before. He had comprehended 49 swords in an hour, which was at odds with what he was doing now. Moreover, Yi Futian had not reacted to anything in all that time. He was just cultivating. Everyone waited like this for 3 days. Everyone thought that it would have been quicker, but Yi Futian sat there the whole time, comprehending the way of swordsmanship. Some people ran out of patience and said, "It looks like we expected too much. Let's go." On saying this, they flashed away. Once they had taken the leave, other people followed, feeling a bit disappointed. They did not know how long they would have to wait. They had their own cultivation to work on and did not want to waste too much time here. However, at that moment, the endless sword will flowed back into Yi Futian's body. He opened his eyes and looked forward. He stood up. He is finished. Everyone was speechless. The time they had waited for had finally come. 3 days. "Perhaps we expected too much," said Yi Man as she saw Yi Futian move. "We've already waited 3 days, might as well watch," whispered Yi Tianyu. Yi Man did not say anything else. Yi Futian walked forward to the 50th peak. 49 swords in 3 days, and from now on he will be even slower. "I don't know if I can wait until he finally fights Li Daozi," someone said. Yi Futian continued forward step by step and walked past the 50th peak. Just as everyone was discussing this, the sword mountain suddenly burst forth with sword light that shone upon Yi Futian's body. He was bathed in brilliant sword light, and he continued walking forward. Then, the 51st mountain lit up. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. He had comprehended a sword in a single step. He had comprehended a sword in a single step. Those who had been about to leave suddenly froze, as if they were completely unable to move. They stared at Yi Futian in shock. He had comprehended 49 swords in a single hour, then had sat in contemplation for 3 days. And just when everyone had been sure that he would spend even more time here, he had finally returned to his former state. By the time he had taken a single step, a sword had already been comprehended. But how was that even possible? After the first 49 swords, the rest were no longer representative of a single sword style. How could he have comprehended one of them with a single thought? A group of figures flashed over towards Yi Futian. They stared at the figure that was bathed in the endless, brilliant light of the way. No one in the divine palace could compare with the speed with which he had comprehended the first 49 swords. Was he trying to create some sort of unprecedented historical event here? Could it be that the 3 days he had spent in contemplation had been used to form the basis for today's performance? This guy is putting the disciples of Sword Palace to shame. Zhuang Hong had stayed the whole time. How could the swordsmen of the Sword Palace maintain any of their dignity after watching Yi Futian? Although Li Daozi had comprehended 49 swords in a day, he had needed to spend a little bit of time after each sword, as each one grew more and more difficult. But Yi Futian had gone right to the 51st sword after the 50th as if there had been no difference between them and the first and second swords. He had comprehended them in a single thought. Yaya was among the crowd as well. She had comprehended many swords in the past few days as well, but at that moment, she was also speechless seeing how easily Yi Futian comprehended these swords. When had the swords of Sword Comprehension Mountain been this easy to comprehend? At that moment, Yi Futian was walking through the mountains. He looked at the 52nd sword peak with eyes still flashing with a brilliant, marvelous light. In a flash, the images of swords were imprinted in his mind. He could tell just by looking at what kind of sword will that was. Great oaks grow from the smallest acorns, and everything rises up from the cornerstone. He had spent 3 days contemplating swordsmanship. He had thoroughly comprehended everything on the basis of those first 49 swords. He had achieved mastery through a comprehensive study of swordsmanship. Now, any sword that was born from those 49 swords would not fail him. Now he was even able to easily comprehend the first few swords just by looking at them. Suddenly, more sword images appeared in Yi Futian's mind. Sword will move towards him from the peak, and sword light shot up into the sky. He began to walk forward again, as light and easy as a cloud. He had comprehended the 50-second sword. Although Yi Futian was carefree and unrestrained, the cultivators who were watching him were absolutely speechless. Although he had paused for a moment, it had only been for a brief period of time. He had still comprehended the next sword with a single thought. Many people were thinking the same thing as Yaya. Could the swords of Sword Comprehension Mountain really be so easy to comprehend? It seemed to have been absolutely effortless. But if so, why could the disciples of Sword Palace not do it so easily? Could this swordsman from Taishan Mountain really be that talented? None of the disciples of Sword Palace could compare to him? Afterward, he contemplated the 53rd sword, the 54th, the 55th. He began to slow down. He was no longer able to comprehend them in a single moment. But even though he was slowing down, that was only compared to everything that he had done before. As far as those watching were concerned, he was still doing it in the space of a single thought. He looked at each sword mountain for only a moment, then he would comprehend the sword. He was going so fast that within an hour he had comprehended up to the 72nd sword. How many days did it take for Li Daozi to comprehend 72 swords? The disciples of Sword Palace asked each other. They were naturally comparing him and Yi Futian. 7 days, someone answered. The memory was still fresh. After all, when Li Daozi came to the Divine Palace to seek the way, he had gone to Sword Comprehension Mountain and had caused a stir. Thus, many people still remembered it. The amount of time that he had taken to comprehend all those swords was something that most people could not match. Now he had been surpassed. In fact, the word, surpassed, was not strong enough to describe what had happened. Li Daozi had taken 7 days to comprehend 72 swords. Yi Futian had done it in an hour. This made everyone feel as if they were in a dream. A single hour. It was almost frightening. It is meaningless to compare him to Li Daozi, said the man who had spoken before with a sight. As far as I know, this is the fastest that anyone in the history of the Divine Palace has comprehended 72 swords. Many people heard him say this, and they blinked in surprise as their hearts trembled once again. A swordsman from Taishan Mountain had come here and broken the record. At that moment, many elders opened their eyes within various halls and temples in the Divine Palace. Their senses stretched out through space and descended upon Sword Comprehension Mountain. One of the elders in Sword Palace even stopped cultivating. He stepped high up into the air and looked across the distance towards Sword Comprehension Mountain. At that moment, several figures walked to his side and looked off into the distance, whispering, 72 swords. 72 swords, and in only 1 hour, answered the elder softly. He seemed very calm, but he was disturbed on the inside. Otherwise, why would someone who was as high level as him care about some junior? Moreover, why would he go out himself and reveal to the world that he was paying such close attention? Is that a record? Asked the man beside him. Yes, answered the elder with a nod. It was only one word, but everyone there could feel the weight of that word. He had set a record for contemplating the first 72 swords, and now there were only 9 left. But the record for these last 9 swords could probably not be broken. After all, this depended on the cultivator's level, and Yi Futian was not at a high enough level. Comprehending the 81st sword meant that you would forge a sword wheel of the Great Path and become a sword emperor. And the elder had heard that Shen Jing had just reached the nirvana level at the land of proving the way. How could he become a Renhuang so quickly? But even so, this record for comprehending 72 swords was enough to prove this man's genius talent. Is he a personal disciple of Lord Taishan? Someone asked. Such an outstandingly talented swordsman who had cultivated at Taishan Mountain could not be just an ordinary cultivator. Moreover, he had been part of the quota of people who went to the land of proving the way. This implied that Taishan Mountain had known how outstanding he was. Lord Taishan said that he would never take another disciple. Perhaps they are not master and disciple in name, but are in reality, someone answered. Everyone nodded to themselves. This was probably the case. Such a talented swordsman must have been personally taught by Lord Taishan. If that is the case, then it is truly a pity, sighed the old man. He was a man who appreciated talent, and he wished to take a disciple. But since this man was a disciple of Lord Taishan, he would not be able to steal him. Also, Shunjing had not expressed any interest in entering the Divine Palace. Moreover, there was only one person at the Divine Palace who could compare with Lord Taishin given his current level, so how could he even think of stealing his disciple? Even if the Sword Palace made a move, they would not have the advantage. At that moment, Yi Futian was not thinking about any of this. How could he know that an elder in the Divine Palace had already taken notice of him? After the 72nd sword, Yi Futian's steps slowed, but he continued forward. He looked at the 73rd sword peak. His eyes seemed to be filled with radiant light. He could clearly feel the true will of swordsmanship within that peak. This was the reason that he had been able to comprehend the first 49 peaks so easily. But at that moment, even though he could feel the will within, and he wanted to link up with it, it would not be easy. The image of a sword appeared in his mind, seeming to be extremely profound. This was an ultimate sword art that had been formed from the first 49 sword arts. Even he would have a hard time comprehending this one. Yi Futian stopped for a moment. Finally, the 73rd sword peak shone with brilliant light. It resonated with Yi Futian, and a bridge of sword will seemed to form between them. He's still so fast. Everyone was shocked by this. Endless sword will appeared around Yi Futian as well. Sword will flowed through his veins, and he had forged a swordsman's body. He continued forward and began comprehending the 74th sword. This time he spent half an hour comprehending it. The 75th sword took 2 hours. The 76th sword took 5. The 77th sword took an entire day. Everyone waited 3 whole days before he comprehended the 78th sword. There were only 3 sword peaks left that he had not comprehended. In less than 10 days, he had comprehended 78 swords, and there were only 3 left. Everyone felt numb. They had no words to express the astonishment in their hearts. They had never seen talent like this before. However long it took him to comprehend the final swords, the people here would wait that long. Before Li Daozi had come here this time, he had also only had 3 swords left, and now he only had 2. But how long had it taken until he had reached this point? And how long had it taken Shunjing of Taishin Mountain? Yi Futian's body had transformed into a sword body of the Great Path, and sword will flowed all over him. He looked towards the last 3 sword peaks. Sword will wrapped around the 79th sword peak. From what he could see, this was not just a simple mountain but was instead a sculpture of a sword god. The Great Path filled the mountain. He saw the image of a sword god and then saw many sword shadows appear, each one looking incomparably powerful. You cannot comprehend this sword. Take some time to sit and contemplate it, said Li Daozi as he sat there. Yi Futian looked at him, then smiled and nodded. He did not continue trying to comprehend it. It seemed as if he had taken the other man's words to heart, and so he sat down and began contemplating. This made everyone look surprised. Yi Futian really trusted Li Daozi that much? In fact, Yi Futian had not stopped because of Li Daozi's words. He had done so because, as soon as he had seen that sword art, he had realized that he could not comprehend it. The first 49 swords were one level, and the next ones had been another level. These last 3 were at a level all their own. If he wanted to comprehend them, he needed to thoroughly understand all of the previous sword arts. Thus, when he heard what Li Daozi said, he sat right down and began cultivating. In fact, even if Li Daozi had not said anything, he would have done that. Li Daozi did not look back at him, but when he sensed what Yi Futian was doing, he rejoiced inwardly. He rejoiced that this swordsman from Taishin Mountain was even more talented than he had imagined. He rejoiced that even though they were foes, he was still willing to listen to his advice. This was an opponent who was worthy of respect. He was looking forward to their battle. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Yi Futian was cultivating in front of a sword peak, acting like nothing in the outside world mattered to him. At that moment, the only things he was thinking about were swords. Yi Futian was cultivating in front of a sword peak, acting like nothing in the outside world mattered to him. At that moment, the only things he was thinking about were swords. The images of countless swords appeared in his mind, But Yi Futian still was not able to comprehend their most important elements. Although he could clearly see what kinds of swords they were, he could not understand their essence. He knew that this sword art was fast, extremely fast. You would become one with your sword. There would be swords everywhere, and you would be everywhere. After comprehending for a while, Yi Futian shifted his gaze from the sword peak and looked to another one to his right. This was the mountain that Li Daozi was at, the second of the sword peaks. Their two mountains were not very different, and in fact, it could even be said that they were parallel. At that moment, Li Daozi was immersed in his cultivation. As Yi Futian was looking at the sword peak, sword will flowed across his body, making everyone look surprised. What was Yi Futian trying to do? He had still not comprehended the third mountain. Was he planning on skipping it and going right to the second one? Yi Futian could sense endless sword will gathering at the sword peak. Thousands of swords appeared in his mind, producing a certain resonance with each other and with the great path. This formed a particular frequency, and in the end, all the swords merged into one, making the sword will become even more terrible. So sharp! Yi Futian said quietly. Although he was not able to comprehend these two swords, he could still sense what the essences of these two sword mountains were. In the past, the cultivators of these sword mountains had informed everyone that they could use the 49 sword styles as the basis to create more sword styles. In the end, all the swordsmanship was the same, and each style had the same two essences: speed and sharpness. Incredible speed and incredible sharpness were what every swordsman sought after. The sword was the king of the battlefield, the master of all attacks. It was fast and fierce. If a sword were not fast, then at this level, it would be hard for it to hurt anyone. If it was not sharp, it could not break through anyone's defenses. Swordsmen pursued ultimate speed and ultimate sharpness. They all pursued a superior form of swordsmanship. Yi Futian had not been comprehending for very long. He stared at the sword peak with a profound look in his eyes. His thoughts entered the mountain, but he soon withdrew his divine spirit. He understood now. No wonder Zhuang Hong had said to him that when he comprehended the 81 swords, he would be able to forge a sword wheel of the great path. In fact, one could say that sentence in the negative as well. If you could not forge a sword wheel of the great path, then you could not comprehend the 81st sword. The two were connected. He was absolutely unable to comprehend this sword right now. He did not know if he had to actually reach the Renhuang Plain before he could comprehend it, but at the very least, it was impossible to do in such a short time. Once he had understood all this, Yi Futian returned to the third mountain. He looked at the endless fast swords and the countless sword shadows. He sat there in contemplation for 7 days. No one left over the course of these 7 days, and even more people came to watch. He only had 3 swords left, and they wanted to see if he could comprehend them all, or at least how many of them he could comprehend. Once he had done so, would Li Daozi fight him? At that moment Yi Futian was dazzling. He seemed to have formed a true sword body. And it was not just him. The sword peak was shining brightly. Endless sword will flowed over it. A beam of sword light shot up from Yi Futian into the air, cutting through the sky. It moved incredibly quickly, then disappeared in an instant. A sword slash appeared in the air. Then there was a second sword and then a third. Sword after sword shot into the air, and beams of sword light bloomed. Soon, endless sword marks appeared on Yi Futian's body, and countless sword shadows were flying through the air. It seemed to be responding to Yi Futian. Sword shadows shrieked across the sword peak and then shot up into the clouds. He had comprehended the 71st sword. Xin Jing had done the same thing as Li Daozi. Only the last 2 swords were left. Moreover, the time that Xin Jing had taken to do so was not at all comparable to the time that Li Daozi had taken. It was a new record for sure. "He's going to go all the way," whispered Zhuang Hong. "He is going to continue. He is going to comprehend all the swords except for the last one. He is truly a masterfully talented swordsman," Yi Tianyu said. He now wanted to fight Yi Futian more than ever. How would he have felt if he had known Yi Futian's true identity? Would he still want to fight him? The disciples of Sword Palace were speechless. Would Yi Futian be able to comprehend all the swords? He had already comprehended so many in such a short time and had caught up to Li Daozi. At that moment, Li Daozi opened his eyes as he at their cultivating before the 80th sword mountain. He stood up and turned around. His long robe whipped in the wind. Sword will flowed out of his eyes as he looked at Yi Futian. Yi Futian had comprehended 79 swords, just like him. Yi Futian could naturally feel Li Daozi's sword will. He looked back at him. He was the foremost junior member of the divine sword Li family, the strongest person below the Renhuang level at Sword Palace, and one of the strongest people in the Divine Palace. He had been waiting for him here. If he had not been able to comprehend this many swords, then he would not have had the right to face him and would have no right to be arrogant. But he had not comprehended all these swords because of Li Daozi. He had done it just for the purpose of comprehending swordsmanship. But at this moment, he and Li Daozi were standing at the same point. They were both right in front of the 80th sword peak. Li Daozi looked at Yi Futian and said, "I am Li Daozi, a member of the Li family and a disciple of Sword Palace." Li Daozi obviously wanted to fight. The fact that he had introduced himself like that showed how much he respected his opponent. The fact that Yi Futian had made it this far showed that he was worthy of respect. He would fight Yi Futian to test his swordsmanship and to seek the path. His swordsmanship was not quite good enough, so he had to seize any opportunity he could get to improve. He was not sure if this talented, brilliant, famous swordsman from Taishan Mountain would be able to give him this opportunity. "I am Xin Jing, a musician and swordsman from Taishan Mountain," said Yi Futian. Previously he had introduced himself as a musician, but now that he had displayed his talent for swordsmanship, he had begun introducing himself as both a musician and a swordsman. "The two of us have comprehended the same amount of swords. Neither of us will have the advantage in this battle," said Li Daozi. As he said this, he raised his hand. In a flash, endless sharp swords appeared on all the peaks, then floated up into the air. They shone with brilliant light and reflected off of each other. All of the swords pointed at Yi Futian. Previously, Zhuang Hong and Yi Futian had moved mountains at Celestial Worthy Mountain. Now Li Daozi was using mountains as his swords. Everyone looked up at the 79 peaks. Swords floated in the air above them all, and all of them were pointed towards Yi Futian. Terrifying sword will spread out from each one of them, and at the same time, they were trembling and resonating with each other. And not only that, but sword will was flowing around the swords as well, and each thread of sword will seemed like an actual sword. Li Daozi stood on the 80th mountain like a sword master. He was bathed in endless sword light. What powerful sword will! Everyone was looking up into the air at the floating words. This was Li Daozi's power. He was the most powerful person at the Sword Palace below the Renhuang level, and he was not far from reaching the Renhuang plain. Li Daozi waved his hand and then chopped it towards Yi Futian. "Instant sword," he spat. This was the instant sword of the divine sword Li family, but Li Daozi had used the endless sword will from the mountains to form it. At that moment, endless sword light pierced through the air and shot towards Yi Futian in an instant. There were 79 sword mountains and 79 swords. Yi Futian was about to be destroyed by this sword will. It seemed like he would be turned into dust. As Li Daozi attacked, Yi Futian seemed to produce a certain resonance with the sword mountains. As the swords descended from the sky, he pointed upwards. As he pointed, a beam of brilliant sword light erupted above, and a light curtain swept out around him. No one could see Yi Futian being covered by all the swords. It just looked like a chaotic scene. 79 swords descended, surrounded by endless sword will, and they smashed into Yi Futian. But Yi Futian pulled out a single sword, and this sword resonated with the sword mountains. The 79 sword peaks linked up with his sword, forming a celestial sword curtain that protected Yi Futian from above. The disciples of Sword Palace trembled as they beheld this scene. The two of them were displaying dazzling swordsmanship. It was simply terrifying. Both Li Daozi and Xin Jing were geniuses with a sword. When he saw that he had been blocked, Li Daozi still had no expression, and there was not the slightest trace of disturbance in his eyes. He stepped forward, his robe flapping in the wind. Not a single sword above Yi Futian had been destroyed, and they produced a sharp sound. The sword will around them grew stronger and stronger, and more swords flew over from the mountains. Li Daozi stretched out his hand downward. A powerful pressure surged down, and every one of the swords shrieked as they cut through the sword curtain bit by bit as they were forced downward. Yi Futian stretched out both his hands, and the sword will flowing off the sword mountains not only transformed into a sword curtain, many sharp swords formed and appeared around him. "Go," he said. Countless swords spiraled upwards, sweeping out from within his sword curtain and smashing into his opponent's swords and violently destroying them. A powerful storm of sword will whipped up between them. They are well matched, thought everyone. Their swords seemed to be of equal power as they faced each other and were destroyed. At that moment, they were not the only ones who were watching the battle. They could faintly sense that there seemed to be people from the divine palace whose divine spirits were descending upon them. They were observing the fight. Many Renhuang-level figures must have been secretly watching. At that moment, there were several sword emperors within the divine palace standing together and looking off into the distance. Li Daozi has been cultivating at the divine palace for a long time, and his sword arts are quite impressive. Shen Jing is incredibly talented, and he has a powerful ability to comprehend swords. But in terms of comparing their sword will, I am more interested in Li Daozi, said one of them. It is unlikely that he will lose, said someone else. No one else expressed their thoughts. The elder nodded, then continued to watch the battle from a distance. Even he could not see the outcome of this battle. After all, the two of them were displaying incredible power. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.